Hello, welcome everyone. Some familiar faces there. Hi, Leanne. So we're going to get started. Welcome to the 4101 on floods for renters with Tenants Queensland and Resilient Kurilpa. I just want to let everyone know that we're recording this and to allow people to watch back at any time. So just keep in mind that it's going to be publicly available from the Resilient Kurilpa website, and just keep that in mind when you're posting comments and questions as well. So Resilient Kurilpa's work is based in Kurilpa, which encompasses the suburbs of West End, South Brisbane, Highgate Hill and Hill End, all with the 4101 postcode. Kurilpa is an Aboriginal word meaning place of the fawn-footed melomys, or the native water rat, or the Kuril. And I want to acknowledge this place name and also the resilience and sovereignty of the Jagera and Turrbal peoples, their custodianship and ongoing connection to country, including the meandering Maiwa River, and pay respects to elders past and present, as well as any First Nations people joining us today, or tonight, I should say. My name is Paula Hardy. I'm a design strategist living in Kurilpa. I'm a PhD candidate at Griffith University in the area of service design and climate adaptation. I volunteer with the West End Community Association, who is a member of Resilient Kurilpa, which is a network of local residents and representatives from community organisations in our area. We formed just after the February 2022 flood with the aim to strengthen flood resilience within our rapidly growing community. And we develop free online tools and resources for our community, but also for other floodplain communities to adapt to their own circumstances, with a key focus on apartments, because we've got a lot of those. Joining us is flood recovery solicitors Emma Webster and Abigail Pfidze from Tenants Queensland, which represents the concerns of all Queensland tenants who live in rental accommodation, primarily with their free rental advice service Q-Stars, which you'll learn about soon. We also have Melinda McInturf, who is the Community Resilience Coordinator at Community Plus, which is another member organisation of Resilient Kurilpa. So this workshop's going to cover what it's like renting on the floodplain. We're going to use Kurilpa being the example, but some of the impacts we'll talk about may be relevant to various other communities on the Brisbane floodplain. We'll look at who Tenants Queensland are and some common scenarios that renters in Queensland face, and then some preparatory actions for renters to take, and finish with a Q&A. I want to acknowledge at this point that the workshop content will show impacts and damage from past floods, which some people might find distressing or triggering. So please do take time to take a break or step away at any point, remembering that the workshop's going to be recorded for later viewing, and that there is also free flood recovery psychological support available from Change Futures. So you can access that on changefutures.org.au. You can submit a question for the Q&A at any time, also by selecting that Q&A tab at the top. I just want to remind everyone that this webinar has an educational focus that focuses on renters' rights and actions. So please do keep that in mind when you're formulating your questions and comments in the chat section. We won't unfortunately be able to discuss or answer any political comments in this forum. So as we go along, we will run some poll questions to get a sense of where people stand with flood preparedness, what our community is feeling and so forth. And I really want to encourage you to share any stories or reflections or thoughts in the chat box that might be prompted by these questions as we go along. So let me bring up the poll. For the first one, for the first poll question, I want to ask, what is your connection to flood-prone areas? So are you currently renting in a flood-prone area? Do you plan to move to a flood-prone area? are you working in the community or the climate resilience sector, or are you a service provider in flood related issues? So you can submit that there. As I said, this workshop will focus on renters' rights and actions to prepare for future floods. Our neighbourhood in Kurilpa has one of the highest proportions of renters in southeast Queensland. We have over 60% of residents as renters here. We also know that apartment buildings make up around 80% of dwellings in our area. So that presents fairly unique challenges when it comes to flood preparation, response and recovery, particularly as our neighbourhood continues growing over the next decade. So on that, I want to ask at this point, how prepared do you feel for future floods? Do you feel, if out of 5, do you feel 1 representing very underprepared or 5 representing very prepared? Natural Hazards Research Australia last year published a really fantastic report on community experience of the 2022 floods. And this quote from it reads, "Prospective residents need to know about flood risks before they commit to purchase or rent properties." And that's because it allows them to choose whether they want to accept those risks for themselves and their families, rather than passively having risk transferred to them and only finding out the true consequence when they have floodwater lapping at the door. So ongoing residential development on and near the Brisbane floodplain represents a sort of a key challenge for us in Kurilpa around flood risk awareness and preparedness. We have thousands of new residents and renters arriving to our neighbourhood each year between floods. In fact, the majority of residents in the Gabba ward during the 2022 floods did not live at their current address at the time of the 2011 floods. And between those 2 floods, at least in our area, we estimated 28 apartment blocks were constructed in the flood zone, and approximately 16,000 additional residents had moved to Kurilpa, many of them living on that left-hand side on the Coombs Swamp, which is west of the Montague Road. During the 2022 flood, we saw around 3,000 to 4,000 residents and 2,100 dwellings in Kurilpa being affected. So sharing knowledge about what it's like to live with flood risk and take steps to prepare are key activities of Resilient Kurilpa. So I want to ask here, have you been affected by a flood before? Our website holds many resources to support floodplain communities to prepare. One of these tools is the Kurilpa Flood Library, which holds over 170 cards, including a collection of local flood stories. And some of the common impacts we saw for residents and tenants are captured in these stories. And as we go along, we'd love to hear your stories about what your experience has been like living and renting through past floods. So please do feel free to share those in the poll or in the chat section. So around half of the Kurilpa Peninsula experienced unnotified power outages, and you didn't have to be in an apartment with floodwater lapping at your door to have that impact. So these outages caused apartment lifts and intercoms to break down. That resulted in mobility barriers for some people, as well as preventing others from keeping their medications cold, from recharging their devices that they rely on for communication, for work, for daily supported living. And many residents experienced significant unexpected delays in repairing those lifts and restoring power. So we heard that one apartment building on Melbourne Street was deemed uninhabitable for more than 3 months due to having no power and issues with the fire alarm system. Another apartment block experienced flooding in their 3-hectare basement, which took out all of their essential services. As the floodwaters rose, residents raced to move their vehicles and their belongings from basement car parks and low-lying streets. We saw flooding on Montague Road and Melbourne Street create an island effect where residents were unable to sort of drive out. That caused some people to drive in loops, trying to find a way to escape. Many residents lost possessions and vehicles kept in basement storage units, car parks and low-lying streets. For renters, there is a serious risk of losing or having your possessions damaged. So renters may not be fully insured for flood damage, noting here that body corporate and building insurances do not cover personal possessions, only common property. So without contents insurance, some renters face the risk of loss of cars or their belongings kept in storage units. And what's more, flood insurance is becoming increasingly unavailable or unaffordable. Some residents and body corporates who monitor rising river levels are able to give prior warning to residents for when they need to begin relocating their possessions out of the basements. However, not all body corporates are set up to do this yet, and there is no regulation around this. So individual renters are really encouraged to keep an eye on the weather warnings themselves. And with each historical flood, the Kurilpa community really springs into action to support each other. In 2022, we know residents and community groups coordinated the voluntary cleanup of houses, streets and basements actually faster than the council could get the mud army out to us. And while stories of supporting each other are plenty, like neighbours and housemates, bringing supplies to each other and support to recharge devices or volunteering to clean up someone's property, it's important to also prepare for unforeseen circumstances, such as getting sick or having your belongings from your rental property removed if you're away or on holidays during a flood. So all in all, a flood disaster can have compounding impacts for renters who may already be experiencing precarious housing situations. They may have access to less resources to recover or be new to the area without that prior local knowledge of floods. And tenants also have less of a say in how to minimise the effects of future floods on their homes. So, for example, by implementing flood mitigation or retrofits measures to their rental property and buildings, or setting up warning systems, communication systems in their apartment building. So last poll question, I really hope these are showing up for everyone. What are your biggest concerns or worries when it comes to future flooding? So now I'm going to hand over to Emma and Abby, who will talk about Tenants Queensland's work and some common scenarios that renters may experience after a flood. Have you got it, Emma? Oh, you're on mute. You're on mute.
There we go. Thank you. Thanks, Paula. I'm Emma from Tenants Queensland, and I'm here together with Abby from Tenants Queensland. Tenants Queensland has been operating since 1986. We're a specialist statewide community legal service for tenancy matters funded through the Legal Aid Community Legal Service Program. Tenants Queensland provides free tenancy advice for residential tenants, including social housing tenants, those living in caravan parks and boarding house residents, assisting tenants to understand and exercise their legal rights and responsibilities. We represent the concerns of tenants in public debates with the government and industry bodies, distribute tenancy publications, provide tenancy law training and community education. We assist tenants in a number of ways to facilitate tenants' understanding rights and responsibilities, support to resolve tenancy issues, writing correspondence such as emails and letters, filling in tenancy forms, attending or preparing for a QCAT tenancy tribunal hearing. We have access to translating interpreting services if needed, and we can provide referrals to other services. I also wanted to briefly address in my introduction why housing is important. So from my experience, housing is critical to a person and their family's well-being. Housing means stability in education, employment, family and community connection, and someone's mental and physical health. When safe and secure housing is lost due to a natural disaster, the consequences can be devastating. On my next slide, I've got some contact details for Tenants Queensland. We have a 1300 number, and there is also an online contact form on the Tenants Queensland website. And I also suggest that people look at both the TQ and the Q-Stars websites, as we've got some great fact sheets and other resources on those. Tenants Queensland provides a number of programs. Many people have let me know that they've received help from the Q-Stars program, which is our statewide tenant advice and referral service. Q-Stars offers advice about matters under residential tenancy law, from bond lodgement to database listings. Abby and I work under the flood recovery program, and we assist tenants after the impact of a natural disaster. So next I'm going to talk about the 4 common scenarios that we commonly find tenants seek our assistance about after a flood. So my information is a brief overview, and I encourage tenants who want further assistance to contact us. So the first scenario is when a tenant wants to leave after a natural disaster due to the damage of a property. So there are a number of ways to end the tenancy. The first way is a mutual termination agreement. So this should always be in writing with terms that both parties agree on. For example, the tenant is not liable for reletting fees or rent after the handover date. So the second way that a tenant may end a tenancy is by providing a notice of intention to leave, the Form 13 for non-livability. So the tenant may use this when the premises have been destroyed or made completely or partially unfit to live in. The notice must be issued within 1 month of the event, and there is a minimum notice period of the same day, but if a tenant wants to, they can give more notice. So it's always a good idea to take photos of evidence of non-livability in case there is a dispute. So there are other ways to end a tenancy, for example, due to unremedied breach, and this may depend on when the tenancy ends. When the tenant vacates after a natural disaster, they should liaise with the owner or the property manager about the expectations around cleaning. So why a tenant is usually responsible to leave the property in the same condition upon exit as entry, with fair wear and tear accepted. It's not the responsibility of the tenant to clean the damage from a natural disaster, and of course this could be too dangerous. So the second scenario is where a tenant wants to stay. So the leaseor may end the tenancy by issuing a notice to leave, a Form 12, on the grounds of non-livability. So the leaseor can terminate this by giving within 1 month of the event, and it can be terminated on the same day. So it's important for tenants to know that a residential tenant cannot be evicted from the premises without an order from QCAT. And if the tenant wants to, they can dispute the notice to leave if they believe the premises are livable. If the parties can't agree about the tenant staying, then the next step would be RTA dispute resolution. And if the dispute resolution is not successful, the tenant can apply to QCAT disputing the grounds of the notice to leave. So the third scenario is about rent. So generally, if the premises are destroyed or wholly unfit to live in, the rent would automatically decrease to 0. If the premises are damaged or the standard decreases, the tenant can negotiate reduced rent with the owner or agent. So make sure any agreement about a rent reduction is in writing. And if the parties can't agree on the amount of reduced rent, the tenant can apply for RTA dispute resolution and then to QCAT for an order about a rent reduction. So the claim for the rent reduction must be made while the tenant is still in the tenancy agreement. So the fourth scenario is about repairs. It might be electrical damage, structural damage, leaks or mould. And tenants might seek assistance not long after the event, or it might be some time. So the first step would to be notify the agent or the lessor about their concerns. If the repairs are not attended to, the tenant can issue a breach notice, a Form 11, to notify the lessor or the agent about the need for the repairs. The notice to remedy breach must give the lessor or agent at least 7 days to do the repairs. The tenant can also request free dispute resolution from the RTA. And if the repairs are not carried out, the tenant can apply to QCAP for a repair order. So a repair order could include inspection by a qualified person, such as a mould expert or a builder, the repairs, a rent reduction, compensation and termination if the repairs are not carried out within a time period. So the repair orders stay with the premises until carried out, and the lessor can be fined for non-compliance. So the law also allows for the tenant to arrange and be reimbursed for emergency repairs up to a value of 4 weeks' rent if the tenant's unable to contact the emergency repair contact within a reasonable time frame. So what's an emergency repair is defined in the legislation. For example, a serious roof leak, gas leak, dangerous electrical fault, flooding, serious storm, fire or impact damage. And so for the tenant, an important time limitation is 6 months for a breach of agreement. The clock will start when the tenant's aware of the breach, and the 6 months clock will stop with either an application to the tribunal or by making RTA dispute resolution. Oh, and over to Melinda now to talk about the rental support grant.
Hi, I'm Melinda Bakatoff. I'm the Community Resilience Coordinator at Community Plus Queensland, which runs 3 neighbourhood centres across the inner southwest of Brisbane, and we also run the Q-Stars program for the southern side of Brisbane. The accommodation package, the rental support grant, is grant funding for renters who are forced to leave or relocate temporarily or permanently after the 2021-2022 flood or rainfall events. The package is for owner-occupiers or renters who are principal place of residence was deemed uninhabitable for a period due to one or more of the flood events. If you've had to move out and pay for accommodation for a minimum of 14 days, or you are attempting to live or have returned to the property but it is not safe or habitable. If you're worried about where you're going to live while your property is repaired, and if you need assistance with temporary accommodation while the property is repaired. This is available to tenants and also owner-occupied. If you need assistance with this, it is retrospectively available to anyone who has been impacted by these events in 2022. As long as you have been out of the property for 14 days or had to move property due to the damage at your premises where you are living. If you need assistance with this, you can call Community Plus. Our service navigators can help you to access this government funding. Our number is on the screen, and you can also ring the Department of Housing and on 3013 2688 and speak with the accommodation team. Thanks.
Thanks, Melinda. So for my final slide, I'd like to talk about the preparation action for renters, the 4101 on floods. So the first action that tenants can take is when putting together your important documents, include a copy of your tenancy agreement. This will be very important so you know who to contact and other details about your agreement. So the second action is be aware of Tenants Queensland's phone number. Call us as soon as a problem arises, as sometimes there's time limits to act. We're very happy to give early advice about an emerging problem. I do often think when I'm talking to a tenant, oh, I wish they'd called me a couple of days before or a couple of weeks before, so please call us early. And the third action is be aware that tenants' goods are not covered under landlord insurance, so tenants should consider whether it's worthwhile for them to obtain their own contents insurance. And I'm going to hand back to Paula for action number 4.
Yeah, so in terms of what you can do about fortifying the resilience of your property as a tenant, we'd like to encourage you to ask your property manager in writing about what preparations have been made by the body corporate or the landlord to mitigate future flood impacts to your building and to your residents. So you can go about that by linking them to Resilient Kurilpa's apartment toolkit, which there's the URL for that there, and questioning them on what steps they've taken to minimise the damage that will come in the next flood. So that sort of concludes the end of what we've prepared, and we wanted to jump into a Q&A at this point. I can see there's one question that's been published or submitted to the Q&A. So I really encourage people to submit their questions now if they have any. This one here is about belongings. So they've asked, how long can I leave my belongings at the premises after a flood? And can the landlord throw out my goods or my documents or my money? We saw that happen in Kurilpa. One of the stories in our library was about someone who walked down to the flooded area and, as you do, offered to clean up to homeowners who are out on the street, throwing their damaged goods and furniture out onto the street, and then afterwards realised that the belongings that they were throwing out wasn't in fact the homeowners, it was the tenant, and they were away. So I think that's a fairly important question. Did you want to take that, Emma or Abby?
Right. So it's important to remember that the tenancy agreement must be terminated before the lessor can remove any of the person's goods. So if the tenancy agreement continues, they can't remove their goods. So what happens with documents such as birth certificates? They would go to the public trustee if they were left behind. If things like Medicare's cards are left behind, they go back to the provider. And so there's times when the lessor can dispose of the goods. And so that is when the value of the goods is less than $1,500 if the goods are unhealthy or unsafe. So that might apply after a flood if the goods are unsafe. It's when the value of the goods would decrease due to storage. So that would be something like food. They wouldn't have to store food. It's when after storage, if the cost of it would be greater than the amount raised in the sale. But if these conditions are not met, then the lessor has the obligation to store the goods for 3 months at the tenant's expense. And after that 3 months, the lessor can sell the goods to recoup their costs. And then if there's money left over, they would give that to the public trustee.
I'm sorry, Emma, that's 6 months that they,
6
1 month, sorry, 1 month for general tenancy, and then 28 days for accommodation, and then up to 3 months for a caravan, yeah.
Selena has asked, does the real estate agent or the landlord or the property manager or the body corporate have to disclose how the property is impacted by flooding? That's a great question. So if I'm looking to rent in the flood zone and, you know, I have a general awareness that it floods in Kurilpa, and I want to ask the real estate agent or the body corporate, can I do that about disclosing? Like, are they obligated to tell me?
No, so they're not obligated to tell you, but you know, sorry, just give me a second. I'm so sorry, I'm a bit nervous. No, they're not obligated to tell you, but there are flood maps online that are available for you to have a look at before you do apply for a property, before you do sign on to take it. And that's probably the best kind of precaution you can take, but no, they're not obligated to tell you, unfortunately.
Right. And what about, for example, requesting like a flood report? Are there possibilities to do that sort of thing, or contact the body corporate to ask about the sort of the specifics of how the building might have been damaged or impacted in the last flood? Can tenants do that, prospective tenants?
I mean, you can certainly try, but I think the flood maps are probably a pretty good tool to get around that if they are unwilling to kind of provide that information. So yeah, I think the flood maps are a very great way of kind of finding out any of those details. So I'd suggest going that route first, and then if you can't find anything, maybe try asking the body corporate or the agency. But again, they might not be willing to disclose that information, and they're not required to.
Right, okay. Because I guess the thing that the flood maps overlook is the actual detail of the impact. So, you know, how vulnerable are the basements to flooding? Is there a possibility of, did people lose their cars in the last flood? Does the building have flood planks that they install? Resilient Kurilpa have a flood mitigation plan that sort of goes through all the different measures that body corporates can take to build their resilience and plan for flood. So I guess a question that we put in the preparatory actions is to ask those body corporates about whether they do have a flood mitigation plan. Is there anything stopping potential renters from reaching out to body corporates with that question before renting on a legal level?
No, not at all. No.
Okay.
They reach out, yeah.
So on the topic of damage to property, we do have some other questions here that were submitted by the community before this session. This one here is, if my landlord is waiting for an insurance claim to be processed, should I continue to pay rent whilst the property is in disrepair?
So it's important to always continue to pay rent while there is a dispute. Otherwise, you risk being breached for rent arrears and possibly a termination. So a tenant can, of course, negotiate a rent reduction, and if that's not successful, can make the application for RTA dispute resolution and then a QCAT application.
Okay. We have one from Leanne here. A good question for a tenant to ask the property manager would be, what preparation measures does your building put in place to help mitigate losses for residents? So that's a really good way to phrase that question we were previously speaking about in terms of doing sort of preliminary investigations before renting, or if you're already renting in an area that you know is in that flood zone mapping provided by the Brisbane City Council. Another question we have here is, who deems the property uninhabitable? So, for example, if I say the property is uninhabitable, but my landlord says it isn't, what does someone do in that situation?
So if there is a disagreement, you could lodge a Form 16 dispute resolution request for RTA, providing evidence for why you think the premises are non-livable. If you have already left though, and due to non-livability, just make sure you've got evidence to support this. So take lots of photos, any pictures and documentation, just to support your view that the premises are non-livable, just in case the lessor does pursue you for break lease fees. So it just protects you essentially. But yeah, you can at least try to go to the RTA first and see if you can settle the matter there.
We have a couple of questions in the Q&A. This one says, can a landlord argue they are not liable for damage to rental premises where the damage relates to common property under a community title scheme?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
So can a landlord argue that they're not liable for damage to rental premises where the damage relates to common property under a community title scheme?
Emma, did you want to take that one, or did you want me to?
Well, the lessor would still have obligations under the Residential Tenancy Act. So it may be that they have to pursue the tenant's obligations through body corp.
So this one here is, how long can I leave my... Oh, no, we answered that one. I think that's all in the Q&A. Let me check the... Miranda here has said, oh, sorry, we'll go to Diana first. It might be more useful for renters if there was a community inputted property update about those kind of property specific flooding issues. Yeah, that's a good point. The rental market moves so fast, applicants won't have time to wait for a response and still get the place. That's true. even if the property manager was happy to share that info, which I doubt many would share with potential renters. That's a really great bit of feedback for us at Resilient Kurilpa. Diana, thanks for submitting that. Miranda here has said, is there any specific financial support that renters can access if their home is flooded? Or would you need to pay double rent, for example, rent at the damaged or flooded property and also temporary accommodation at the same time, especially in the case of a dispute?
You want to answer that one, Melinda?
Yeah, so at the moment there is assistance, financial support for renters that are having to pay rent at temporary accommodation. So if you had to do that in 2022, when the flooding event happened, you could apply for the accommodation package for the rental support grant. But generally speaking, there is no, before this rental package became available, we had people that we were helping that were paying both ways. But as Emma and Abby have both said, it's about asking the landlord or the property manager for a rent reduction and working through that with them.
And just to be clear, that rental support grant that you speak about, Melinda, that so people, if they experienced having to pay for temporary accommodation in the last flood, they can still apply for that retrospectively?
That's correct. As long as you've had to pay for accommodation outside of the property that you normally reside in for more than 14 days, you can apply for that. So you may have done that in February, March 2022, as long as you have the receipts and you have information that proves that you had a tenancy at the property that you were living, and then it was deemed uninhabitable, that you had to move to another property. You can actually move back to the property as well. So if the landlord then fixed the property and you move back there several months later or even a month later, as long as it's more than 14 days that you were out of the property.
And in terms of that rental support grant moving forward, because it's tied to the 2021-22 flood event, I guess it's sort of important to point out here as well that if we have another flood next year, that grant doesn't necessarily cover that, or we don't know if we're going to get another rental support grant or some sort of funding for tenants to access in future floods, right?
That's correct. It was the first time that they had offered this grant because there were so many people impacted that had to be out of their homes for much longer period this time. And because of the housing shortage, people had to make other arrangements. So if you've been living with a family member and that you were paying towards, you can prove that you were paying towards temporary accommodation, then you can, and you didn't get money from an insurance company for that, then we can help you with that paperwork to claim that.
That's actually a good point. I remember we spoke about the other day, Melinda. So in terms of tips now, so if I'm renting next year and we have a flood, what advice would you give me to support me in applying for another grant if they stand one up?
Our advice, just like Emma and Abby said, about having everything in writing. So having something from your landlord that says that the property is uninhabitable or that you couldn't live there for that period, even if it was around that you needed to leave because the flood water was entering, you thought the flood water was going to enter the property. So as long as you have receipts for the accommodation that you paid elsewhere, it can be an Airbnb, it could be you may have paid friends to stay at their property. The thing that you have to prove is that it was for temporary accommodation. You don't, if you can't prove that, lots of people paid it in cash. We've been helping people with statutory declarations about that, but that is complicated that you don't have proof. So in the future, if you're going to pay your friend to stay at their house, I'd be doing a direct debit from my bank account or a transfer that says for rent at the premises, so that you know that in the future you can print those things out from your bank statement, and the monies that goes to your friend, family, that you have proof that you have paid, that is what you've paid for.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks for those tips. We've just got a comment here. Yeah, Miranda said that's great advice. Thanks, Melinda. L. Smith has commented, communication is key when it comes to flood prep to all residents. Body corporates and building managers struggle to have externally managed agent properties provide their tenant details so that they can be communicated with and understand the building's processes in an emergency. We experienced this in 2022 and it continues to be a problem. That's a really good point. And thank you for sharing that that experience. That's something that Resilient Kurilpa's flood mitigation plan tries to cover and support body corporates in managing. Contact lists and keeping them up to date is one of the sort of key struggles, it sounds like, for you. And it's something that we write about in that flood mitigation plan. Another question here, we've got a couple being typed out, but while we're waiting, there's some questions that came in earlier. This one is about housing standards. What are the minimum housing standards and when do they apply? So, for example, what do I do when mold affects my property?
I'm going to take that one a bit.
I mean, sure, yeah. So the minimum housing standards came into effect on the 1st of September 2023. In relation to flooding, the ones that are probably most relevant include whether the premises are weatherproof, whether they're structurally sound, whether there's any mold and dampness, and how good, I guess, the plumbing and drainage is at the premises. So essentially, if there are any issues around minimum housing standards, and the premises are damaged because of that, you can actually go to QCAT for emergency repairs under that, and go straight to QCAT because it's urgent, as opposed to going through the RTA first and then going to QCAT. In respect to mold, essentially you need to be able to provide evidence that it is not your responsibility, that it's the property itself that's damaged, and not due to you, because there can be a lot of conflict between agents and tenants, and the lessors and tenants as well, about who's responsible for mold, just because mold is so common in Queensland. So we would suggest getting a mold or building report if you can afford it, or if you're willing to kind of pay that cost, just so to show that there is an issue with the building and that it's the reason that there is mold in the premises. You will probably need to pay for these yourselves, and you're unlikely to probably get that reimbursed. But so just go in there knowing that, and then in the interim as well, just doing your best to mitigate that loss. So clean the mold where you can, obviously taking photos first before commencing any action with QCAT or disputing with the landlord. But yeah, just try to clean it as best as you can, because you do have that duty as a tenant as well to mitigate the loss to the landlord. Thanks, Abby. Selena's just commented here saying she wants to reiterate that communication is key. She says that many buildings in 4101 have undergone changes in property managers post 2022 flooding. That's true. There's also a lot of buildings, particularly in that Coombe Swamp area that I showed in the slides earlier, that are actively working to implement mitigation measures in their building. That sort of takes up a key aspect of Resilient Kurilpa's work, is working very closely with body corporates to help them implement whatever physical measures to the building, whether it's backup power sources, flood planks, more sophisticated communication systems and warning systems. We've got really skilled people living in Kurilpa who contribute their knowledge and their work in this area to our group. So I guess that's just another important point to make there as well. Miranda's asked on the mold question again, what mold damage, would mold damage be a premise for a rent reduction?
So it certainly would be, as long as it's not caused by the tenant. It's not their actions. For instance, they're not using the exhaust fan in the bathroom, then the tenant could claim a rent reduction. So with a rent reduction, you have to be in the tenancy agreement to claim that. the other options for that person would be a breach of agreement claim for compensation, or also they could do a repair order about the mould and also claim compensation or a rent reduction within that order as well.
Another question we've got here is, if I'm flooded into my property, so trapped in your property, which we saw a lot of in Kurilpa, which is stopping people from going to work, can they claim compensation?
So no, the lessor's not obligated to compensate you for anything that is not related to the tenancy, unfortunately. So there may be other courses of action you could take, but definitely not from the landlord.
One last question I've got in my prepared questions is, when looking to rent, oh, actually we asked that one. I've got no more questions. I can see Leanne's typing something out.
There's some questions in the Q&A.
I think I've asked them all, haven't I? Oh, I've got a new one here. Woohoo. I was away on holidays and my car damaged some infrastructure in the building when it floated to, when it floated to the ceiling in the car park. I am liable. No one called my emergency contact to tell them it was flooding. That's a great question, and I'm sorry that happened. Abby or Emma, can you take that question?
That question, is the person liable for the damage because it was their car?
They have stated here that I am liable, but no one called their emergency contact to tell them.
Yeah, that does sound like an unusual scenario, that they're liable because of the damages to the flood. I mean, it sounds quite complex.
I think that wasn't an unusual scenario from what we saw in our area. Tens of thousands, or if not hundreds of thousands of dollars of cars went underwater in the basement. So this person is saying that their car must have floated to the top of the basement and damaged common property, I'm assuming. So without sort of further clarification for that question, would someone be liable in that scenario if their personal possessions damaged common property?
But probably in the first instance, I'd contact my insurance company, because they'll certainly advocate for you as well in that regard, and like work out who is liable, like what are your obligations. And sometimes it is within insurance, like sometimes people are partially liable as well.
Okay.
Yeah, and if necessary, you could always go to AFCA, which is the Australian Financial Complaints Authority, if that did need to go further. But that's definitely an insurance dispute for sure. It probably doesn't sit quite under tenancy.
We've got a comment from Leanne. A good tip for all residents, renters or owner-occupiers is to always ensure you provide emergency contacts and your contact information to the building manager yourself. Don't rely on the property manager to pass it on, as many times they are external property managers and not on-site managers as such. That's a really good tip for renters. Leanne, thanks for sharing that. This person has said, we've been working through our emergency procedures and agree with Leanne's comment that residents should provide their details and not wait for their property managers. Joe said here, also free legal support is available for flood impacted people. That's a really good point to make. Thanks for sharing that, Joe. I'm looking for more questions, but I can't see any. Melinda, can you guys see any on your end?
No more on our end.
No more questions. Okay, well, I think maybe we might wrap it up in that case. I want to thank Emma Webster and Abby Pfidze from Tenants Queensland for joining us and for sharing your extremely valuable knowledge with us. Don't forget to check out Tenants Queensland's website and save the Q Stars number in your phone for future reference. There is a really fantastic webpage on flood on the Tenants Queensland website. And also Resilient Kurilpa will put together a Q&A on our website to capture all of this information that's been exchanged in this session. And you'll also be able to share the recording of this webinar as well with any of your renting friends or clients. Thanks also to Melinda from Community Plus and Larissa for supporting us. Melinda's just said in a last comment here, Caxton Legal and Legal Aid provide that free legal support, and you can contact Community Plus for a referral. You're a good bunch, aren't you? All right, thanks everyone. Feel free to hang around to keep exchanging comments in that chat section, but I'll conclude it there. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Oh, and Adrian said, don't forget more webinars are coming. Yes, Resilient Kurilpa has a lot of webinars coming up. The next one we have is on the 13th of June, which is all about apartment flood mitigation planning. That one will be run by Adrian from River Point Apartments. And then the following, on the 27th of June, on a Thursday evening, we will be talking about flood mitigation, flood planning for apartment residents. So the first webinar focuses on what to do with your building, and the second webinar will focus on how to manage your residents. Again, same style of webinar. We'll record them so you can watch them when you have more mental capacity to take on this sometimes very heavy information. But yeah, please do share our webinars and our upcoming flood resilience events with your networks. And yeah, please register. Invite your body corporates to the webinar. Yeah, exactly. All right. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to end it there. Have a great week.
Thank you.